The previous video introduced the concept of evolution both at the micro and macroevolutionary scale, gave an introduction to natural selection, and then gave some evidence for the operation of evolution. Today's lecture is going to focus on natural selection, give a few more examples of how natural selection operates. So in the review of microevolution, we talked about the fact that evolution depends on gradual genetic change from generation to generation. And this leads to morphological and behavioral changes with the associated phenotypes. And there are four main evolutionary mechanisms associated with microevolution, and natural selection is one of these, and one of the more important, as we'll see. And as we discussed in the last video, natural selection is tied to the production of adaptations, traits that lead to increased survival and reproduction to the individuals that have those adaptations. And there are a set of requirements for natural selection to work. The first is that within a species, individuals have to show heritable variation in some traits, a morphological or behavioral trait. And heritability again means that that trait has a genetic basis such that it can be passed from parent to offspring in a predictable manner. So I'm going to go through this example again that I gave in the last video. Here we have a population of flies that vary in wing shape, so we have the first requirement for natural selection, that there is variation among individuals with a trait. And we're going to assume that this is a heritable trait, meaning that the individuals with big wings have genes or alleles associated with the genes that are responsible for the production of wings that say make big wings. Individuals with the small wings, at those same loci, gene loci, they have alleles that direct for the production of small wings. And then there are combinations of those that may give intermediate wing shapes. But individuals do vary, and they vary because of the genes that they have. Now, a second requirement for natural selection is that there is variation in survival and reproduction among the individuals that you're studying. And the third requirement for natural selection to be responsible for this variation in survival and reproduction is that there's differential survival and reproduction that is linked to the traits in question, such that individuals with the best traits have higher survival or higher reproduction or some combination of those, such that they pass on more copies of the genes associated with that adaptive trait. So in this case, there is a filter that the environment is providing that's challenging certain individuals to have survival and reproduction. And individuals that have the better traits, the more adaptive traits, are more likely to have high rates of survival and reproduction. In the example I gave last time, perhaps these individuals with the small wings don't have good enough locomotion capabilities to be able to get to scattered resources, and so they end up dying before reproduction. Individuals with the medium-shaped wings, they can survive long enough to reproduce some, and so there's the maintenance of these genes to some degree in the population. But individuals with the really large wings are able to get to these food resources more quickly, they're healthier, and they have more time for reproduction. And so there's an increase in future generations of big wings in this population. So this filter is providing a predictable outcome for future populations. If the distribution of resources is such where this filter stays the same, we would expect that in future generations we should see a continual increase in the proportion of individuals in the population that have big wings because of this natural selection filter. These big wings are the adaptive morphology in this context. Now, there's actually another way that selection can operate. We'll talk about this more later in the semester, but perhaps it has nothing to do with food and flight capabilities. Perhaps individuals with the small wings are just not chosen, if they're males, are not chosen by females to mate. Females may look at them and say, no, I don't think so. Or even the individuals with the medium wings, they look at them and they go, no, I don't want to mate with you. But for some reason, individuals with the large wings are preferred by females And so they end up having much higher reproductive success, despite the fact that it may even hurt their survival, such that the larger wings are some form of handicap and maybe make them more prone to predation or actually may have lower flight capabilities. But that survival challenge is offset by the increased attraction that they get from females, and so they end up having higher reproductive success. That form of selection we'll talk about more in future lectures. It's called sexual selection. Here's another example of natural selection. So we see a population of mice that range in some phenotype. So we have some that are dark, kind of brownish, some that are very white, more camouflaged, given that they're living in a white sandy environment. Those are the darker pelage in a white sandy environment are actually going to stand out more, and so they're going to be poorly camouflaged. So we see that there's variation in the population, our first requirement for natural selection to operate. And let's say that if you mate individuals with a dark pelage, you produce offspring with dark pelage. You mate individuals with a lighter pelage, and you get light mice. That indicates that this variation is heritable, so that there is a genetic basis for it. Now we have to test the idea that there is a natural selection filter here, that camouflage in a white environment does matter. So if there are a number of individuals born into a population, and not all of those are going to survive at the same rate and reproduce at the same rate, what could be the cause of that? Well, if it is camouflage, predatory birds may preferentially pick off the individuals that are darker in coloration, and a higher proportion of individuals that are lighter colored are those that survive. Those are the only individuals then that mate, and so we see an increase in the mean color of the population shifting from a range of darker colored and lighter colored to predominantly lighter colored individuals after a number of generations. So again, natural selection is providing the filter that allows us, if we know what that filter is and it's consistent, to know how to predict how this population will change generation after generation. So let's introduce some evolutionary terms. The individuals that I've been describing as having higher survival and reproductive success, in evolution we say that these individuals show greater fitness. Now, fitness is defined as the ability of an individual to survive and reproduce in a competitive sense against other individuals in the population. So fitness is a relative term. Individuals are trying to maximize their fitness, meaning they're trying to pass on more copies of their genes to the next generation than others of their species. See, that's what drives the evolution of a population of a species. Individuals that are maximizing their fitness are having a greater role in driving the direction of the evolution of that species. And so you have to think about fitness as being this competitive venture in which individuals, their goal is not to just reproduce, but to maximize their fitness. Those with the most adaptive traits are passing on more copies of their genes and having a greater impact on the evolution of their species. So you're going to hear me say this over and over throughout the semester and throughout this series of videos. The evolutionary goal of all organisms is to pass on as many copies of your genes as possible into future generations. So that means the evolutionary goal of an organism is to maximize fitness. All right, let's give an example of an experimental study that demonstrates natural selection. Here we have a population of snapdragons in which we have artificially created a population using potted plants in which you have two different phenotypes. You have the white phenotype and the yellow phenotype. And the white phenotype has these two yellow spots on part of the petals. So we've created a situation where 75% of them are white, 25% of them are yellow. So this is our starting population. There's clearly variation and there's phenotypic variation because there are two different colors. So we have to also now, again, if natural selection is going to operate, is this color heritable? And sure enough, if you look at the genetics of this, it's a very clear Mendelian trait, fairly simple single gene trait in which white flowers have a dominant allele, shown as the capital S. So you can be a white flower by being homozygous dominant or heterozygous. Either way, that's how it gets you there, and that's what's being shown here in this chart. The only way you can be a yellow flower is to be homozygous recessive, have two recessive alleles. So now we have to ask, is there a filter that could give you different fitness levels among individuals depending on their flower color? And so in this experimental study, they put potted plants into a meadow to document the pattern of pollination by wild bumblebees. And sure enough, the results showed that some plants did have more bee visitors than others. And bee visitation is linked to pollination. So these individuals that received more bee visitors were more likely to broadcast their pollen, such that reproduction could then occur to produce a better seed set in individual flowers that are receiving that pollen. And sure enough, some plants did produce more seeds. So we see that there's a difference among individuals, but is this difference in pollination related to flower color? Is it a non-random factor that's being driven by the phenotype, the flower color that we're tracking? And sure enough, white flowers had twice as many visits. They were just more attractive to the wild honeybees. And it turns out that the honeybees are looking at the contrast between the white and the yellow spots that serve as nectar guides to attract them to these white flowers. So we see that yellow flowers had, on average, one bee visit per flower in the time period studied, and it was about twice that for the white flowers. And sure enough, this led to higher fitness. White flowers did produce more seeds, as being shown here. The yellow flowers, they did have some fitness, right? But the relative fitness is higher in the white flowers. And again, fitness is a competitive venture. Individuals are trying that are going to have the bigger impact on their species are those that maximize their fitness, such that the subsequent generation, when you raise the individuals, the seeds from individuals, you see that what started off as a 75% population of white flowers and 25% yellow flowers is now 77% white, 23% yellow. That's not much of a change, but that is exactly what you would predict if there is a fitness advantage for white flowers. In other words, the white flowers are adaptive. This is a very small amount of predictable change being driven by natural selection, but generation after generation of if this pattern persists could lead to a drastic change in the frequency of white flowers in this population. Clearly this is an artificial population here, but it's demonstrating how it could work in nature. Well, let's talk about a natural example. So the Galapagos finches are a series of 13 species of finches that differ drastically in bill shape and size, among other characteristics, among the islands of the Galapagos archipelago. And they have been studied, famously discovered by Charles Darwin, but they've been studied subsequently by other scientists, including Peter and Rosemary Grant, who focused on one species, the medium ground finch, Geospiza fortis. They worked on an island called Daphne Major, which is a small island in this change, and they've been studying this population for decades now. And this long time frame has allowed them to pick up some subtle changes in the evolution of bill size and bill shape in these species that match expectations of natural selection. So one of the reasons they picked a small island is such that they could study the entire population. So there are, on average, about 1,200 birds per year on this island, and they capture all of them every year, put bans on them take various measurements so that they can track their evolution generation after generation. And one of the factors that they've seen is that the birds do differ in their bill size. And this variation has consequences potentially for natural selection. Big birds tend to be more efficient at eating big seeds. Birds with small bills are more efficient at eating small seeds. So this is individual variation within this one species of bird. I mean, clearly the species of Galapagos finches have more drastic changes across species, but even within this one species, there's a variation in bill shape. And so that can be shown right here in this 1 year in which they captured 751 individuals. You can see that the average bill shape was about 9.4 millimeters in beak depth, kind of how tall the bill is. But that ranged from some individuals being 6 to some individuals being way out close to 14. So there's quite a bit of variation, but most individuals are packed right around that mean. So this shows pretty much what we would call a normal distribution for this trait. So we've reached our first criteria for natural selection to be able to work. There is some variation among individuals in some trait. So now we have to say, is this trait heritable? Because it could be that individuals with small bills have small bills because when they grew up, their parents didn't feed them a high protein diet, and so they just developed smaller bills. Okay? And maybe individuals with the big bills had better parents that brought bigger food, and so that's the reason. Maybe it doesn't have anything to do with genetics. They may all have the same genes for producing a bill, but it all depends on diet. And if that's the case, natural selection is not going to work. So how do we test that there is heritability? Well, one way to do that is do a mid-parent analysis, where you look at the average size of the parent's bill, and you see if that correlates to the offspring's bill size. And you see that in 2 different years, despite the fact that there's these slopes are different in placement, the slopes are the same in these two different years, and we'll get to that later. But there's a strong positive association. Big-billed parents in both years produce big-billed offspring. Small-billed parents produce small-billed offspring. Okay, so that's an indication that there's predictability with generation to generation in who's breeding, who's producing what offspring. So that's an indication that this trait is heritable. All right, so is there a filter? Well, first of all, we have to demonstrate that not everybody has the same fitness. So do only some individuals live to produce, or is there equal survival reproduction? Well, one benefit of doing a long-term study is you can sometimes see some pretty drastic challenges faced by birds in nature. So in 1977, the population dropped from about 1,200 to 180 birds, so an 84% reduction in this 1 year as far as survival goes. So now the question is there a difference between those individuals that survived and lived to reproduce versus those that didn't? Well, it turns out that there was a natural selection filter in place that made it where some individuals were more likely to survive this drastic reduction in population size. So in 1977, there was a severe drought that led to a reduction in available food as far as seeds go. And as the food started to disappear, you see that so if you look at the average abundance of seeds starting off in 76, as you get into 77, there are many, many fewer seeds available. Well, what are the characteristics of those seeds that were still available at that time, same time period? Look, it's just the big seeds. All the small seeds are gone. So it turns out, remember, big-billed birds are more likely to eat efficiently the big seeds. So this led to a filter produced by natural selection because of this drought and the remaining ability or availability of big seeds, that more big-billed birds survived this challenge. And again, that's because big bills are better for eating big seeds. Large-billed birds had a selective advantage Meaning, in this situation, under this challenge, large bills were the adaptation. So, did we see evolution? Sure enough, if you look in 76, before the filter, before the challenge, before the drought, the average bill size was about 9.4. After it, you look at the survivors in 1978, the average bill size was over 10. Again, not a lot, but is exactly what you'd expect with natural selection under these circumstances. And not only did more big-billed survive, more big-billed birds had greater reproductive success. And so if you look at the size of the bill of finches that hatched prior to this drought, it was much lower than the bill size of the finches that hatched afterwards. So big-billed birds survived better and they reproduced better. And when they did reproduce, they produced baby birds that also had bigger bills. So that's a clear demonstration of natural selection. But even a better demonstration that it's not just something to do with big bills that is always an advantage. An advantage of doing a long-term study is sometimes the environment changes such that what was formerly an adaptive trait is no longer adaptive. So in 1983, the reverse situation happened. Instead of a drought, there were heavy rains, and those heavy rains actually were better for the plants to produce small seeds, and so there were lots of small seeds available, but not a lot of large seeds. And so in 1984, we see a selective advantage of small-billed individuals, and meaning small bills under this environmental filter were the adaptation. And so we see an expected shift in the next generation to 2.5% smaller bills in the population. And you may be thinking, well, it kind of makes sense that, if you're a big-billed bird, you may only be able to have the force to crack open a large seed, but if you're a big-billed bird, you should still be able to eat the small seeds. And it all comes down to efficiency. If you don't have the right tool for the job, you're not going to be as efficient. And so small-billed birds, while large-billed birds may have been able to eat these seeds, the efficiency of them being able to do so, it cost them as much. It's almost like me when I first learned how to eat crayfish. When you go crawfish boil, when you're not from the East Texas area, everybody's out eating you really quickly until you get the technique down. Once you do have that behavioral tool, then you have the adaptation to be able to move forward too. But once if you're talking about bills, if you don't have the right size bill, you're just not going to be as efficient as individuals with the appropriate size bill. And so there is that selective disadvantage you have in those circumstances. All right, so I've talked a lot about how natural selection works, but there are lots of misunderstandings of how natural selection works. And so I want to try to address some of the common misconceptions about natural selection. So it's important to realize that natural selection acts on individuals. Individuals have adaptive traits or traits that are not adaptive. But really what it's affecting, it's affecting the population in the next generation. So a lot of people think that natural selection affects individuals during their lifetime, and it doesn't. Individuals do not change during their lifetime due to natural selection. Individuals with the favorable traits, yes, those are the adaptations. They have better fitness, so they're going to contribute more to the next generation, so it's affecting the population. Individuals without those traits have less fitness. Their trait is going to be represented less in the next population. So differential survival and reproduction, differential fitness leads to changes like this shown here. Before selection, you may see a lot of variation, but if there's selection for larger bills, then you're going to see average bill size increase in the population. The other thing is that natural selection acts on phenotypes, but really what it's changing in the population is the allele frequencies that are linked to those phenotypes. Evolution occurs if there are changes in the gene frequencies in the next generation. So in this situation, if beak depth is heritable, small-billed individuals, if they're selected against, they're not going to reproduce. Okay, so they're not going to produce offspring. Large-billed individuals are going to reproduce, but they're going to predictably produce more large individuals in the population. If it was a situation where there was not heritability, there may be just as likely that the large-billed individuals that survived, again, if they just happen to have large bills because their parents gave them high-protein diets, they may produce a range of birds with different bill sizes. Okay, so that would not be adaptive evolution. Natural selection couldn't do anything with that. So this is where we're talking about the individuals that survive are based on the trait that they have, but natural selection occurs only if this trait is heritable. That's how it changes the next generation in the phenotype and also the genotypes that are associated with those phenotypes. Natural selection also can only work with current trait variation. So here's a study using artificial selection to try to increase the average oil content of corn kernels. Now, initially, when they started this study, this was the range of oil content in individuals that were used. And so we see that there's this evolution of increased oil content generation after generation. But once it gets there, it's going to stop, right? It's going to stop at that natural population range until then it starts to go up again. And the reason for that is we, through the introduction of new alleles, have created certain individuals that now do have higher oil content that selection will then see. And these other mechanisms are mutation, gene flow, and genetic recombination. If an individual gets a mutation in this population, this study population, that gives them higher oil content, well, then natural selection can operate to say, okay, now we have a new landmark, a new marker that is maximizing fitness. This is the new target that is the most adaptive, and so this new mutant gene is going to increase in frequency in the population. A new allele associated with corn kernel production could also come through gene flow. Gene flow is when you bring in individuals from outside of the population that have additional alleles that may allow natural selection to proceed. So in this case, if a researcher brought in a new strain of corn that had different genes for the production of more oil, that could continue the experiment. And in some cases, sexual recombination between individuals produces combinations of alleles at different genes that have the capability of producing more oil. So we'll talk about the importance of genetic recombination. But the main point here is natural selection can't get you here until you have the interaction of these other evolutionary mechanisms. Natural selection can only select the best that it can actually see. But once you get combinations of these other mechanisms like mutation, gene flow, and recombination, then you can see natural selection proceeding to produce more extreme traits. Natural selection also can't anticipate environmental change. So let's say that we have a number of years in which there's drought in the Galapagos Islands. We're going to see the continued production of individuals with larger and larger bills as long as there's variation to produce larger bills, until we get to a point where all that genetic variation is used up. And even though there might be a changing environment coming up, individuals can't preserve certain genetic variation to be able to adapt to these changing environments. If the current environment changes again, say to producing more conditions where there's an abundance of small seeds, if we've already weeded out all of those bills associated with just the production of large bills, we have to wait until there's genetic changes that reintroduce those back into the population. So that last example shows you that sometimes there could be time lags in the production of adaptations depending upon the genetic variation that you have. There are also ways that may limit the ability for natural selection to operate to produce adaptations that are just right such as trade-offs, where you may have a trait that needs to serve several functions, and it makes the adaptability of this not perfect for all of the possible functions. So a good example of that is in mosquito fish. The gonopodium is used by males for fertilizing females, and the females, this is a sexually selected trait, females preferentially choose to mate with males with a large gonopodium. However, so they have high reproductive success. However, large gonopodium also makes them more susceptible to predators, so they actually have a higher probability of depredation. So there's this trade-off. If the stronger the female preference is, that would drive this to being larger. The greater the impact of predation, that's going to lead to a reduction of this size, despite the fact that females might like it. I mean, if you have such a large gonopodium that you can't live long enough to reproduce, clearly evolution isn't going to lead to that size. So one of the things I've been trying to point out is the fact that natural selection can lead to, if you know what the environmental filter is and that it's consistent, you can predict how the population will change generation after generation. So in this respect, natural selection is non-random. But don't think that natural selection is progressive. Traits do become increasingly adaptive, but there's not like some goal. It's not like evolution has one set goal. So for example, in the bill shape, sometimes the most adaptive situation in some years was to be big bills. In other years, it was to be smaller bills. So while so natural selection is not progressive in this sense of a goal, like there is one ultimate bill size. And there are certain circumstances in which there are general trends in evolution to see, say, for example, increased complexity and specialization of traits. So, for example, in vertebrates, you tend to see increased brain complexity evolving. That's true as long as those changes are adaptive, but it's not necessarily the goal of evolution to produce more complex and specialized individuals. In fact, there are organisms that, in certain circumstances, show simplification of traits when that is more adaptive. So think about the eyes of cave-dwelling organisms, like this salamander. If you're living in the complete darkness, eyes are no longer functional. So this trait that was adaptive for the production of vision is no longer relevant, and actually losing that is adaptive in the circumstances, because neurological tissue is extremely expensive to produce and maintain. And if you're not using it anymore, get rid of it. And so if there's a mutation that leads to making this vestigial or completely go away, that's actually going to be beneficial in this context. So its simplification is actually more adaptive in this context. Same thing for tapeworms. Tapeworms live in the digestive tracts of their host. They are derived from other worms that have a digestive tract, but they don't need it. They can just absorb their nutrition from their host since they're living in the digestive tract. So this simplification of the loss of the mouth, loss of the gut, is adaptive for this species. And even in us, we don't need a tail. Okay, a tail is not relevant to our lifestyle. And so this has become a vestigial trait. Vestigial traits are great examples of simplification of a trait that is no longer functional and would actually be costly to produce. And lastly, this is probably the biggest misunderstanding that some people have about natural selection is selection acts on individuals. Individuals have traits that are adaptive or not, and they're actually in competition with each other to maximize their own individual reproductive success, their own fitness in most situations. Individuals in most cases are not going to do what's good for the group. So sometimes you hear like, oh, well, this trait has evolved for the good of the species. That's not how natural selection works. In fact, selfish behaviors are more prone to evolution. If there's competition between individuals in the competition for maximizing fitness, selfish behaviors that lead to maximizing fitness, where you drive the bus for the evolution of your species, selfish behaviors, selfish traits tend to evolve very readily. Cooperative behaviors do occur in some circumstances, but only when they're actually good for the individual that's performing this behavior. So it's like, preening, mutual preening. Individuals that are preening parasites off of other individuals are doing that, maybe in some cases, because they're actually eating those parasites and they're getting direct benefit from it. Or they're going to get at least a delayed benefit by developing a relationship with that individual that can help their fitness in the future, for example, by getting their own parasites preened off of them in the future. So cooperative behaviors really, in most cases, have their own selfish basis to them. Truly altruistic behaviors, self-sacrificing behaviors in which you lose some direct fitness potential to help others in having greater survival and reproduction, really can only evolve in the most rare circumstances. We'll talk about when those circumstances do occur later in the semester, but at this point I just want you to understand why that's so rare. Let's say that there is a gene for being altruistic, where you would give up your fitness to help another individual's fitness increase. How is that gene going to get passed on? Okay, you're doing a behavior that reduces the propensity of your genes to be passed on, including the gene for the very behavior that you're showing. So it makes it difficult to explain how these altruistic behaviors would spread and be persistent in a population. I'm giving you a little hint there that it's not impossible, but it can only occur in very rare circumstances, which we'll cover later in the semester. So let's talk about the opposite of that. Why do selfish behaviors persist? Selfish behaviors, again, are those that would allow you to maximize your fitness at a cost to other individuals in the population. But again, this fitness is a competitive venture, so that's exactly what you should do in many circumstances. Here's an example of that. Male lions work to fight to take over control of a pride of female lions when they're in their prime. Now, when they do that, they have absolute mating right with all of the females in that pride. But they have a very short time period in which they're able to maximize the control of that pride before other males in the population are going to challenge them to take over that pride. So what the new males do is they kill off the offspring that are not yet weaned in the newly conquered pride. What this does is it forces the females in the pride to go into estrus sooner, so that they so that the new males can mate with these females and produce their own offspring. Because otherwise, they're just having to sit back and wait for the females that are pregnant or nursing cubs to finish that and be reproductively capable. And they just don't have time. If they want to maximize their fitness, they need to make sure that they're producing more of their offspring as quickly as possible. So selection is favoring individuals with these behaviors, despite the fact that it is costly to other lions and actually may reduce the size of the population, and actually is costly to the species in that way, because we'll see later on this semester that small populations can suffer some genetic problems. So in the short term, this is not maybe what's good for the species. But the individuals with these behaviors, or at least in the short term, are maximizing their fitness. And so these selfish behaviors should evolve as predicted by natural selection. So with that discussion of natural selection, we'll end this lecture, but the next lecture will cover the other three mechanisms associated with microevolution.